So our next speaker is Patrick McCray, is a professor of history at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Originally trained in material science and engineering, he has published widely on the history of science and technology since World War II. Among the topics of his historical books and articles are astronomical instruments, space technology, nanotechnology, and technological enthusiasm among scientists, engineers, and popularizers. His topic today explores how scientists might be able to tell humanists something about big data.
All right, thanks very much, and thank you all for coming out here, and thanks to Anita for inviting me here. Like Dan, I'm sort of in the same boat. I'm in the humanities department, and I work with digital data all the time, but I'm not in the digital humanities. So what I'd rather do is take sort of a roundabout way for about 7 or 8 minutes to kind of come at this issue about digital humanities and what it might mean for folks in the humanities by looking at some parallels maybe from other folks who have dealt with digital instruments, digital data in the past. And I'd like to draw a couple lessons from what I've learned from the history of modern astronomy. And my insight into this comes from last year. I had the good fortune to spend a year at Caltech. And the project I worked on there was basically centered around this question of how did the astronomer's sky become digital? When we look up at the sky, we basically see analog. But when astronomers look at the night sky, the information that they collect and their view of the night sky is wholly mediated by digital technologies, which then ties interesting to this whole question that we hear all the time about big data. Whenever I was at the San Francisco airport on my way up here yesterday, there was this big thing hanging in the middle of the terminal which just said, big data equals security. It was some sort of advertisement for some, high-tech whatever. But the thing I guess I find interesting is sort of like what Dan was talking about. Big data has its own history, but it's a very much more recent one. As near as I can tell, big data in terms of a term really starts being used in the late 1990s, as far as I can tell. But the thing I find interesting about it is if you read almost any article on big data, whatever that might be, and of course it's all relative because the data that 18th century explorers were sending back to Europe from the New World, for them was big data, so it's all kind of a matter of scale. But what you see in these articles is the poster child for big data is almost always astronomy. Almost every one of these articles starts by talking about like some astronomical survey process or whatever, and the petabytes of data that's going to collect and what this means and how many libraries of Congress that equals and how difficult it's going to be to work with, et cetera, and so forth. So astronomy and data are linked in these, their own particular way, but one of the things also I found interesting was in talking to astronomers about their relationship with data and the software engineers and computer scientists who work in collaboration with them. The thing that's interesting about astronomical data is they oftentimes describe it as sort of in this interesting sweet spot. So unlike the data that particle physics collects, the Large Hadron Collider or whatever, where you collect reams and reams of data, but you're looking for a very, very specific signal. So there's that end of the spectrum. But then if you go to sort of the data that the biologists are collecting through proteomics and genomics and all sorts of, their big data things, they don't really know what they're looking for because all of the different possible causalities and correlations and things like that are somewhat ill-defined and could, in many ways be almost anything. Whereas astronomical data is kind of in that sweet spot between specific signal and all sorts of different signals. Then if you sort of factor in the point that astronomical data is commercially worthless, astronomers will freely admit this, it doesn't have any value, monetarily, and it has no national security value. So for those particular reasons, software engineers very much like working with astronomical data sets. It's kind of in this nice, happy spot. So it's kind of one of the things that intrigued me about this. And then there's also this question of data floods and data deluges, which is sort of something we hear all the time. And it intrigued me in looking through the various reports and writings that I was seeing about from astronomers, that they began to use terms about floods and data deluges and being overwhelmed by data at a fairly early time, mid-1970s, so to speak. But they also asked this question of, as they're working with digital data and as they're working with computers, why are they doing this? As this one person says, what are the reasons that lead more and more astronomers to accept this potential disruption? Meaning, why were they allowing computers and digital instruments into the quiet austerity of the telescope dome? Sort of the place for the silent contemplation of the cosmos, and they're letting in these somewhat foreign machines. And the reasons, are probably obvious to most of us in the room. Greater efficiency, greater productivity, greater instrumental leverage in terms of understanding the cosmos. So then we can think about the different ways that astronomers thought about data, and maybe we can draw some parallels to ways that humanists will think about it. And I'll just kind of run through some of these different classification schemes really quickly, but we can sort of subdivide them into about 5 different activities. So we have the issue of converting things into digital data, the process of gathering data, the process of sharing that data, manipulating and reducing that data until something has something meaningful about either the humanities, the social condition, or the universe, and managing this data. How do you manage these vast storehouses of data? So this is something that we see happening in the humanities. It's been going on for a while, this process of converting text into digital format. And again, this was something that astronomers went through starting in the mid to late 1960s, of taking photographic plates that they had taken maybe last year, maybe a few decades ago, and converting it into a digital format that could be stored on a magnetic tape, and therefore could be processed in different ways. So this converting to digital was something that folks in the humanities have already embarked on. Another part of this process was making data that was born digital. So equipping telescopes and other facilities with instruments that would basically record data that already in a digital format. Again, something that astronomers embraced in the 1970s. So by the time we get to around 1980, you have this interesting situation where, imagine the poor lonely photon that's arriving from Alpha Centauri somewhere, and it manages to make its way to Palomar Mountain or whatever. And when it arrives there, it has a number of different possible paths that it can be shunted to. Whereas before in the past, it would always go to the upper right there. It would always go to a photographic plate and be recorded on an emulsion. But by the time we get to the mid-70s, 1980, it can go through any one of these different paths in order to be recorded as data. And oftentimes it was being more or less recorded in a digital format, which was all well and good for astronomers, but this created a problem. The problem was that all of those different instruments, all of those different telescopes, recorded data in different formats, different standards. So you might be collecting your data at Palomar, or you might be collecting your data at the Greenwich Observatory. You weren't able to share your data because they were incompatible formats. So one of the things that astronomers realized by about 1980 was that they needed to develop a common language, a lingua franca, that you could exchange your digital data with this person back and forth. Or if you were a radio telescope user and an optical telescope user, you would be able to exchange your data so you could do what is called multi-wavelength astronomy. So this process of creating a common standard that allows the sharing of data was something that was quite important. And the British then embarked upon this interesting project to not just share data, but to actually share the software packages used to process that data, the image processing. So you'll be able to share your data, but you would also have common tools that you were sharing. Now this raises all sorts of interesting questions as to what historians of science refer to as moral economies. What are the unwritten rules and conventions for sharing? Were you under any obligation to share data with your colleague at another observatory, another institution, or at an office down the hall? And there are issues of prestige and credit and all sorts of other interesting things that go with that. But the basic point was that for astronomers, they were more than happy to work out the ways to share data with one another, but the tools for processing that data, they were more reluctant to share. Because if you had a super good tool for processing your data and working with it, you were more likely to get your publications in a top-tier journal. You were more likely to get greater prestige and credibility. So there were sort of interesting bifurcations of those moral economies that come to that. So all this comes back to the humanities in a couple of different ways, but I think this also brings up some issues that people in the digital humanities will be facing. This was something that astronomers began to face around 1980 as well, as they found themselves working more and more with people from computer science. So there was a spirit of collaboration as well as a spirit of competition, as this cartoon from an astronomy proceeding from around 1982 illustrates. And I'm sort of wondering about this as I see my own institution hiring people in the digital humanities. Are they, just to use the example of the English department at UC Santa Barbara, we've just hired a few people who digital humanities. I'm kind of curious to see how they will be evaluated for tenure and promotion. Are they going to be treated as a computer scientist creating new computer tools, or are they going to be treated along the standard metrics and evaluative tools that we see in the humanities, academic monographs, so on and so forth? And how will they work and play with the other people within their own departments? Will they, have knives and guns behind their backs, or will it be more of a, handshake and a greeting? And I think another thing that speaks interestingly to this also is as our tools become more and more digital, and as our data becomes more and more digital, how does this shift our perception of these instruments? And I show this slide here from another astronomical proceedings from about 1980, where at one point in time, the telescope would have been at the center of this diagram. It was the primary instrument. And all this other stuff would have been the tools and other instruments and things like that that were associated with it. But by the time we get to this interesting time period of 1971, already the telescope has been pushed to the side. What we see here in the center is computer, magnetic tape, universal input-output controller, my favorite, future large computer. Again, sort of illustrating that the telescope, the primary instrument, is been sort of removed from that central position, which kind of reminds me, if we replace telescope with book, printed book, will we see something similar to this? Which then I think raises interesting questions of professional identity. I have a picture here shown of the recently deceased Neil Armstrong at the cockpit of one of the test planes that he flew. And this is sort of drawn from a book by David Mendel called Digital Apollo, sort of about how the professional life of the test pilot was changed by the introduction of new computing and digital technologies, whereas before the traditional stick and rudder flying of the test pilot was central to that professional identity. But by the time you get into the increased computerization, so on and so forth, when the computers are doing much of the flying, that notion of professional identity has changed. And I guess I've sort of wondered, as we adopt more and more digital tools, how does that change or alter our own professional identities as humanists? I mean, if we're no longer going to the archive, working with the actual books, does this alter in some strange, interesting, perhaps productive, perhaps regrettable ways as to what it actually means to be a humanist? So, sort of a way of bringing this all together. What do we learn from looking at these historical examples that are drawn from the historical sciences? Astronomy is a historical science. It's about understanding things that happened in the past. What will we see when we start to grapple with issues of standards, issues of sharing, issues of equal access? And of course, we see this being played out today in debates at libraries of open source, open access publications. What will we see as people such as myself, who are interested in the digital humanities but are not of the digital humanities, are interacting with real dedicated DHers? How will those professional interactions go? How will these new technologies change and affect our professional identities, which have been built up over decades, if not centuries, of crafting the historical profession and what have you? And I guess the final one there, which I have, is reinventing the wheel, and I kind of just sort of threw that in as a thought at late last night, was just kind of wondering, if we can look at what other areas of science or other fields of study have learned from their process of going digital, are there things that we can do or learn from this that will result in us sort of not going through some of those same painful transitions that other professions experienced? So those are my few thoughts, and I look forward to hearing the discussion. Thanks.